Thank you so much. Welcome to the Film Fan Club show. I'm Sam Carrico. Wow, what a big week for movie news, huh? Yeah, the Golden Globes were this past Sunday. Did you see this? Yeah, just what we need, huh? 87 old white men in Hollywood telling us whether or not they thought Borat was funny. No, but seriously, 87 old white men in a room making such important decisions. I haven't seen that since the last time I turned on C-SPAN. Meanwhile, the Berlin Film Festival gave out its first gender-neutral acting award this week. Yeah, I thought this was pretty progressive at first until it dawned on me that this meant that it was possible for a man to win the acting award and then no women would win at all. So then I was offended again. Yeah, during the awards I had to have 2 different hashtags ready depending on how they went. In local news, Leonardo DiCaprio is in Oklahoma this week to meet with a cultural advisor for his upcoming film Killers of the Flower Moon. If you need reminding, this movie is about how Native Americans were treated back in the 1920s, and Leonardo DiCaprio is going incredibly method with this performance. Yeah, I hear he's not even going to give the land back when they're done shooting. Speaking of Oklahoma though, New York City is catching up to our state, reopening their movie theaters this week. I was still a little bit skeptical about this until I heard their new slogan, "Hey, we're safer than nursing homes." I was gonna make another New York joke, but I decided to take a hands-off approach, which is more than I could say for their governor. If my fictitious audience is feeling a little bit deflated this week though, I think I know why. WandaVision came to a close on Friday. Yep, we've had our fun, but it's time to put Vision back into the drawer next to Wanda's bed. This show got pretty dark though. Scarlet Witch was really put through the ringer here. There were times when Elizabeth Olsen looked so distressed that people actually recognized her as one of the Olsen sisters. In all seriousness, I thought the series as a whole was pretty good. The first 3 episodes were some of the hardest to sit through that I've seen in a while, but at episodes 4 or 5, the show kicks into gear and the remainder of its run is truly spectacular. As you can expect, there are plenty of surprises, but I was really blown away by the acting chops of Elizabeth Olsen and Paul Bettany. They are given a meatier and much more character-driven story, with each episode leaving you curious where the next will go. This show subverts your expectations so much that I can just imagine Rian Johnson saying to his assistant, "Quick, write that down," every time an episode ends. The final episode devolves a little bit into the CGI fights that us superhero fans are so used to by now, but it's still all tied to questions about life and loss that at least make the stakes high enough and personal enough that I'm still interested. In the end, the show overall is kinda uneven. I'm telling you, those first 3 episodes were just unfunny parodies of other shows. I can see why they did it though. It's easier to market this as like I Love Lucy, but with Marvel, instead of its loss and suffering, but with Marvel. Okay, we've got a great show for you lined up. Later on, we'll be talking about Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but first, let's take a look at how grief and trauma are used to inform the plot of WandaVision. You're gonna love the name for our next guest, Dr. JANINA Scarlett. Let's get right to it. All right, joining me now to discuss WandaVision, she is a clinical psychologist and author whose upcoming book is titled Superwomen, Superhero Therapy, and for women battling anxiety, depression, and trauma. Dr. JANINA Scarlett is with us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Sam. It's a pleasure.
And of course, I already told you where we'll start. WandaVision, you have a lot of thoughts. What did you think of the show?
Gosh, honestly, I thought it was one of the most tremendous shows ever made. I thought it was a really, really powerful depiction of what somebody with severe grief and trauma might go through. And so watching it, to me, it seemed to possibly represent how somebody might dissociate from their experience, right? So dissociation is when we kind of separate from the reality that we're facing and sometimes go into either a fictional world or kind of shut down. And that happens in individuals who go through a lot of pain because the reality that they're facing might be so overwhelming and impossible. For someone like Wanda Maximoff, she lost her parents. Then she lost her brother, not just her brother, but her twin brother, right? The remaining member of her family, and was completely alone. And let's face it, the only being in her entire universe that ever checked up on her was Vision. And he wasn't even human. And so to lose then somebody that she loved so dearly, somebody that was the one being that pulled her out of her grief, that allowed her to experience joy and love and to know that things were going to be okay, and then to lose him several times over, of course, was so devastating that it's not a surprise that she created this alternative reality where they could be together.
Right. And what I appreciated about this show is that it's not entirely black. Well, what I was really afraid of by the end of the show when they revealed that it was kind of Agatha all along, I was like, oh no, is this going to be showing that really Agatha was the one that created
Yeah.
this messed up universe? But no, a lot of the agency was still on Wanda. Those were her decisions, and she was still really working through these emotions, and it was shown and manifested through her powers. Why do you think is it really so important, obviously, to keep that ownership on her and have her be the one that works through this?
I do, because I think the truth is, clearly Wanda wasn't really fully aware what she was doing. She didn't want to hurt anybody. I think she came across as a villain. And unfortunately, sometimes people who go through grief and trauma might really struggle with compassion and perspective taking, not because they don't want to be compassionate, but because they're in such a deep hole of, of their emotional distress, that just understanding what other people are going through might be unavailable to them in that moment. And so some individuals might think that that person is selfish or self-absorbed, but the moment Wanda realized what was happening and how she was hurting other people, she gave up everything. She gave up her own happiness. She gave up her manifested children and her happiness with Vision, and she let everyone go because the last thing she ever wanted to do was hurt anyone.
What kind of early on in the show, I noticed there were a couple of almost like defense mechanisms that she would have whenever for lack of a better term, the vision of what she was creating in her fictional life started to crack. I know there was that episode at the beginning, at the end of episode 1 or 2, I believe, the beekeeper starts to arrive.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, anytime something is not what it seems in this world that she's created, she recoils a bit. What can you say about how she reacts to early on in the show whenever the image starts to break?
I think a lot of folks who are struggling with trauma, who have been through something really, really traumatic, try to maintain as much control of their life as possible. And so they might come across as controlling and rigid, but the truth is they're just trying to keep everything from going wrong. And so I think, to the best of her ability, Wanda was trying to maintain happiness and protect Vision and protect, her people as best as she could. Again, I don't think she fully had a recognition of the impact of her actions, but this kind of a very kind of controlling reaction is not uncommon for some people who've been through as much loss as Wanda has. And it's not surprising, right? Because the way that we internalize trauma is sometimes so long as I do everything right, nothing bad will happen again, which of course doesn't really work that way. But it's understandable that for somebody like Wanda, that she would try to control as many aspects of her life as she could.
Right. And in this show, she's going through both intense grief, but also trauma. Those aren't exactly the same things, but of course, someone can be going through both. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between those two specific issues?
Sure. Trauma is more of a global umbrella, right? And traumatic experiences can include anything. Traumatic experience can be grief, right? It can be some kind of a loss, like seeing her parents and her building and most of her town completely destroyed, seeing her brother being killed, right? Losing the love of her life. But other traumatic experiences might not necessarily involve grief in terms of a death, but they might involve things, for example, like sexual assault, a car accident, being in a war, right? Being an Avenger like WandaVision, like Wanda, involved a lot of fighting and seeing people die. That alone can lead to trauma too. Some people who are exposed to trauma might develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Some people do not. We don't know if Wanda has PTSD. It was kind of unclear. So people who have PTSD have nightmares and flashbacks about what they've been through. They might really kind of shut down and avoid thinking about what happened. We did see a little bit of that. They might be more irritable and startled. We saw kind of semblances of PTSD in Tony Stark, right, in Iron Man 3, for anyone that remembers that. So it's unclear if Wanda was experiencing full-blown diagnosable PTSD, but it does seem like she was going through grief and some trauma-related symptoms.
How does Agatha kind of fit into all this in terms of, through this lens, Wanda is in a very delicate place in her life, and Agatha comes in and definitely makes things worse, kind of preying on that. How do you read that?
Well, Agatha is a really interesting character. Agatha is somebody that has been through her own trauma too. She, of course, was always power hungry, right? But because of that, she was nearly murdered by her own coven, right? Betrayed by her mother and nearly burned by the other witches. And we could argue whether she is the victim or the perpetrator in that situation. But to Agatha, she is the hero of her own story. And so to Agatha, I think she sees herself as the victim and what happened to her. And as a result of that, I think is probably very triggered if there is another witch who is more powerful than she is, because that to her in the past has meant a literal life or death threat. And so I think seeing Wanda is probably really threatening for her. And so she wants to always be the most powerful witch in the room. And in regard to Wanda, again, I think having somebody that she grew to trust, who seemed to be so helpful and kind and compassionate, who once again betrayed her or hurt her, disappointed her, I think that's yet another blow to her heart, yet another trauma that she had experienced.
Right, and then by the end of the final episode of the show, we see once again kind of her sense of normalcy is displaced. Her sense of, she got used to this new vision and her kind of family there, and then she reacts in a very different way from how she's reacted previously, because part of this is overcoming her past trauma. She really takes ownership of her newfound status as the Scarlet Witch. And I don't know if you saw the post-credit scene where she's astral projecting, and so she's on her way.
Reading a dark hole, yeah.
Yeah, so she's on her way to kind of taking ownership of this. And what do you see for the future of Wanda? Is she still on her journey of recovery?
I would hope so. I think that this is the first time that where something traumatic happened, Wanda had a say, right? In the past, she didn't have a say over when she lost her parents, and she didn't really have a say when Vision died. Like, we could argue that maybe she did a little bit, but she didn't. And in this case, she made a choice. She made a choice to give up her, I guess, manifested family in order to release the people that she unintentionally hurt. And to face her own grief. And I think that taking control over her own trauma experience and allowing herself to grieve, and also standing up for other people and defeating Agatha, I think really helped, at least I hope, helped Wanda to gain some ownership. And I'm hoping that this will put her on the path to healing. But I guess, it remains to be seen in future episodes and in other shows and in Doctor Strange.
Right, yeah, into the multiverse of madness. So
Yes.
It seems like she's going to be playing a pretty large role there.
Yeah.
What would you like for viewers, that don't know? I mean, people like me who don't know much about psychology like you do. What would you like for people to take away from WandaVision?
I think that what I'd like for people to take away is, first of all, no one's grief experience is unique, but there's no timeline on grief, right? Sometimes well-meaning people will say to the person who is grieving, hey, everything happens for a reason, or this person wouldn't have wanted you to be sad, you need to move on. Those messages are very unhelpful. And the truth is, all of us are grieving over something. Most people have lost someone or have been through something traumatic. And whether you cope by watching certain television shows, whether you still experience a loss over someone who died, many years ago, whether you're still facing certain symptoms of trauma, you're not alone in this. It's okay to talk to other people about this. It's okay to share your passions for some shows that you love. And it's okay to reach out to other people and form support groups. I think much like Wanda, a lot of us can understand the loneliness of that pain. And so by sharing your pain, you're also inviting other people to share their own.
Like you said, it was a really good show, and I think this was a perfect time for it. Do you think there's something that something to the idea of something like a show like this, where it's overcoming grief and loss, being released at a time where we as a country and as a world, we're experiencing pretty large loss on a global scale with the coronavirus pandemic. A lot of us have been isolated from our loved ones. What do you think make of this timing?
100%. I think it was perfect timing. And I think that we saw a parallel of that message in the show itself, right? For Wanda, whether it was Dick Van Dyke's show or Bewitched or some of these other shows, that was her safe place. That was her escape, but also her coping skill. And so for so many of us during the global pandemic and loneliness and isolation and loss, it's certain television shows that are our safe place. And I think WandaVision is that for many people.
And before I let you go real quick, can you tell us a little bit about your upcoming book?
Sure. So Superwomen is a self-help book for any women that have been through sexual assault, abuse, misogyny, anyone who's struggled with depression, anxiety, or trauma. So my hope is to help individuals who've struggled with these difficulties kind of become their own versions of Superwomen, right? Or their own versions of Wanda, if you will, by embracing our internal strengths and supporting each other in this progress.
It sounds, again, speaking of stuff that couldn't have come at a better time. Dr. JANINA Scarlett, thank you so much for joining me. And of course, you're welcome back anytime. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Sam.
And finally, with WandaVision now behind us, it's only natural to take a look at the next couple Disney properties heading our way, as more and more trailers, TV spots, and posters are released for Falcon and the Winter Soldier and Cruella. I've noticed a common thread, and that's anarchism. Promotional materials for Cruella seem to package her as a punk rock anarchist outsider, with the anarchist A symbol featured prominently on the poster. But the movie appears to use the stereotypical idea of what anarchy is. No rules, unrestricted chaos. The best and smartest get to do what they want. You can't stop me, coppers! With that depiction, though, anarchism and punk will just be a coat of paint and nothing more. They will serve as a surface-level veneer with no real consideration for what the movements believe, only leaving us with the idea that anarchy equals villain. Anarchists and punk rockers don't typically rob banks for personal gain, and they definitely don't kill puppies to harvest their fur for fancy dress. The movie will likely do no further delving into what anarchism actually is. I'm fully prepared for Cruella to say something like, "Your hierarchy is bullshit and doesn't apply to me, because I'm smarter than you," and then dump a baby into a vat of acid because rules don't apply to anarchists. On the other hand, Falcon and the Winter Soldier seems to offer both sides of the equation, featuring, you guessed it, an ostensibly anarchist terrorist group in the form of Flag Smasher, but also US Agent, who in Marvel Comics is a sadistically violent and excessively patriotic character. Now, with nuanced writing, the show could tell a complex story about how the anarchist terrorists are initially treated as the threat, but US Agent's brutality and war crimes on orders from the US military force our heroes to realize that things are more complex. Unfortunately, what's more likely is that yes, the Flag Smashers are bad, but US Agent is actually a pawn of Hydra, an outlier in our otherwise virtuous military-industrial complex, because surely someone on our side would never do war crimes if they weren't being manipulated by external forces. In fact, it wouldn't be surprising if the show rationalizes US Agent's behaviors by having the Flag Smashers blow up an orphanage or something, I don't know, to assure to the viewer the anarchists are still definitely bad. My fear is that these big mainstream shows depicting anarchists as bad guys will never really go in to examine the good and bad sides of what the anarchist movement actually means in real life. They will probably provide shallow and derogatory representations. In contrast, I hear foreign film industries actually have a history of more accurate and balanced representation of anarchists. So why is it that American cinema is so drastically misrepresents a complex ideological philosophy? Some would argue it's for the same reason that the American entertainment industry has constantly depicted opponents of the state and members of outgroups as villains. Communism threatens the ideas of capitalism, and so Soviets and Russians must be cartoonishly evil. We have to manufacture consent for forever wars in the Middle East, so most Arab characters are painted as unapologetic mass murderers. Activist groups like the Black Panthers or even Black Lives Matter begin to organize against capitalist structures and white supremacist hierarchies of the state. So the news and films depict radical black thought as ruthlessly violent gangsters or even racist villains. Because we live in a time where any philosophy that is explicitly anti-capitalist and anti-state is inherently terrifying to the corporations, governments, and wealthy elites who could lose power and influence if the masses ever had a fair and equal say in how the world in which they live operates. In his book, Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky says, the mass media serve as a system for communicating messages and symbols to the general populace. It is their function to amuse, entertain, and inform, and to inculcate individuals with the values, beliefs, and codes of behavior that will integrate them into the institutional structures of the larger society. In a world of concentrated wealth and major conflicts of class interest, to fulfill this role requires systemic propaganda. So when the average American hears the term anarchist, they probably picture black-clad protesters and agitators in the streets. Maybe they think of a post-apocalyptic wasteland with warring tyrants like Lord Humongous from Mad Max. They think of anarchy this way because that is how anarchists are represented in both the news and entertainment media. Billion-dollar companies like Disney, Comcast, and Time Warner paint anarchists and political outsiders as sociopaths who want nothing more than to steal and rob and enforce their will through violence and kill puppies. Because as long as you think that's what anarchism is, you won't begin to examine the ideology for yourself. Which ends up serving who? Not you. Alright, that's our show. I'd like to send a special thank you to Dr. JANINA SCARLET for being our guest today, and another one to John Leon for additional writing on this closing monologue. Thank you, folks!